The other big talking point of the week has been the UK-EU deal, the new deal, the latest deal. We've been inundated with messages on it on our Talking Politics at ITV.com inbox this week. We'll address some of those shortly. But first, as promised, here's Robert's analysis on the deal and why he believes Keir Starmer could have been a lot more bold in negotiations.
So there's a lot of very interesting politics and economics around this so-called reset between the UK and the European Union. I think it is important at the outset to say that despite all the noise, the impact on our prosperity will be quite limited because the improvement in the terms of trade is restricted to food and what's known as agri-products, the things that farmers produce, and as I say, also our food companies produce. And according to the government's own estimate, that would increase national income by 0.2% of our GDP by 2040. When we left the European Union, according to the Office for Budget Responsibility, that is the government's own forecaster, the cost, because our trade became much more expensive with the EU, the cost of the UK was 4% of our national income. So we have got back a 20th of what we lost. And so, as I say, important not to overstate this. And again, another bit of context that I think is useful. Many people will remember all that dramatic fuss over Theresa May's deal with the EU. The Brexit arrangement she wanted to put in place, it's called the Chequers Agreement, which her cabinet approved in the summer of 2018. It led to Boris Johnson resigning. It led to David Davis resigning, but the cabinet approved it. Parliament never approved it, largely because the Labour Party could not be persuaded to vote for it. Obviously, there were going to be lots of Tories who were never going to vote for it, but there was a caucus of Tories who would have voted for it, and if the Labour Party had joined them, it would have got through. That would have increased our GDP by 2%. In other words, we would have got back half of what we'd lost from Brexit, as opposed to a 20th under Keir Starmer's deal. And actually, I've looked back at the Theresa May deal, and what's interesting about it is it doesn't really cross any of what Keir Starmer says are, his unbreakable red lines, the ones that he put in his manifesto, because it didn't reintroduce freedom of movement, which he said is impossible for him. And it wasn't rejoining either the single market in a pure sense, or indeed joining or rejoining the customs union in a pure sense. One of the things he said, I was at the press conference on Monday when he announced all of this, and he stressed how important it was that we negotiate free trade deals with other countries. There is an argument, just very briefly to be put, that said both the past Tory government and this government slightly overstate the benefits of doing these trade deals with the likes of America and India, since frankly they don't improve our GDP by that much. But let's just give them the benefit of the doubt and say that being able to do those free trade deals with America and India are terribly important. Actually, Theresa May's deal, her Brexit deal, the one that got rejected, allowed the British government to negotiate free trade deals with other countries, which of course is not possible if you rejoin formally the customs union. So when he says things like, we can't rejoin the customs union or the single market because, I gave my promise to the electorate that we wouldn't, and anyway, we want these free trade deals, it is nonetheless the case that the government, in an economic sense, could have been, in these negotiations, much more ambitious than they were. because they could have gone back. Because presumably, if the EU was prepared to allow Theresa May that deal, they presumably, because that Rubicon was crossed by them, presumably they would have been prepared to give that deal to Starmer. And so, while it is patently the case that he's improved relations with the EU, I think there is an argument for saying that he could and should have actually asked for more and could have negotiated more on behalf of British citizens in terms of deals that might have improved our living standards more. And I suppose this takes us on to the politics, really, because in his food, in his agri-food, his food deal, he has accepted the principle that standards for the UK in food for farmers will be set by Brussels, right? So he is, in that sense, laying himself open to the charge. Indeed, this is what's happened from the Tories and Reform, that he is betraying some people who voted for Brexit who thought that the so-called sovereignty argument was paramount. So there are a lot of people who voted for Brexit who said we should never in any circumstances have our rules and laws set by Brussels. Well, he's crossed that Rubicon. He's accepted that when it comes to food and drink, the standards will be set by Brussels, and indeed the European Court of Justice will be the ultimate adjudicator of whether we're meeting those standards. Again, something that Brexiters absolutely hate. And I guess my argument would be, if you are prepared to face up to the criticism from the Tories, from Reform, from Brexiters, when it comes to being a rule taker in food and drink, why not be hung, as it were, for a sheep as much as a goat? Why not have gone further and done it for goods, which is what Theresa May did, right? Theresa May accepted essentially the same principle that Brussels would set rules for standards for manufacturers and for our goods exports more generally, which have delivered, if Starmer had done this, significantly greater economic benefits, while not significantly changing the attack that he's now facing from Reform and the Tories. So I suppose my nutshell of all of this is, given that he now appears to be up for taking the argument to the opposition that there are circumstances in which it's perfectly okay for Brussels to be setting standards for our businesses, if he's prepared to have that fight, why not, therefore, have that fight while delivering a much more ambitious and indeed potentially much more beneficial trade deal for the UK?
So that was Robert's considered take. Keir Starmer didn't go far enough. We've had a variety of messages from you on this, all of which have been pretty critical of the Prime Minister, actually. For example, Alexander Garside said, "Won't Starmer's deal with Europe further alienate Brexit voters and help propel Nigel Farage into 10 Downing Street?" Let's deal with that one, Anushka, because I was looking at some really interesting polling this week by YouGov, which suggests that a majority of people in Britain now want closer relations with the EU. And actually, when you break it down, even Reform voters and Brexiteers, a majority of those also want closer relations with the EU. So I wonder whether this is actually as simple as some people suggest, whether the Leave Remain divide is quite so clear-cut as it once was, and actually people can see the nuance and the benefit of having closer relationships, as long as Starmer doesn't completely betray the core principles of Brexit. What do you think?
I mean, I think that is the government's gamble, to think that people's position has shifted on this, that they want close ties, that they want to see the economic growth that keeps being promised. And I think for the government, economic growth is more important than some of the other factors they might be up against. That said, like it always has been with Brexit, I think there is the kind of, here's the kind of numbers, here's the economic arguments, and then here's actually what it means on a whole load of different levels to do with identity and feeling and emotion. And, we talk about, giving up fishing rights and allowing EU fishermen to come into our waters. And you can look at it in terms of stark numbers and say, well, the loss financially from that is much smaller than the gains we get from being able to export food more freely into the EU. But when you look at some polling, and I've actually got some on the Peston programme this week, and you say to people, what would you see as a betrayal? This kind of deal for fishermen would be seen as a betrayal by more people than those who see it as not a betrayal and something that's okay
so
to do.
totemic, isn't it? Fishing is so totemic.
And so it's not always just about, and this is what we learned in 2016, what do the headline figures tell you? It's about what do people think about our society and our relationship with Europe. Interestingly, in the same polling, fewer people think a youth mobility scheme would actually be a betrayal of Brexit, even though that's causing a lot of concern in some parts of the media. But I think that ultimately will depend on what it actually means for our immigration numbers, which, by the way, when I asked someone in the Home Office about it, they didn't really understand what it would mean for our immigration numbers.
What are they calling it now? Youth experience scheme, isn't it?
Yeah.
Rather than
Just an experience. No migration, just an experience.
Nobody's going to live here. They're just going to have a short experience and then go home.